Hi, I'm Greg Corombos. Welcome to Banking Compliance Insights by Wolters Kluwer, a podcast series from Wolters Kluwer. This series was created to deliver insights on compliance trends and strategies for navigating today's regulatory and risk environments. Today's episode, How to Support Lending to Our Nation's Service Members, will focus on navigating the intricacies of lending to this group. Here to lead our discussion on this subject is Wolters Kluwer Vice President of Banking Compliance Solutions, Samir Agarwal. And he is joined by Matthew Frank, a regulatory compliance analysis consultant with Wolters Kluwer. Samir, let me pass the conversation over to you.
Thank you, Greg. As you guys have heard, today we're going to talk about the different service member-oriented policies and lending criteria that really help in these unique responsibilities that these individuals have. As they serve our armed forces, there are a lot of complications that can happen with timing, with when bills are due or when mortgages need to be paid. And there are different avenues that lending institutions must make available for those that serve in our armed forces. Welcome, Matt. Tell us a little bit about your role and what you do on a day-to-day with Wolters Kluwer.
Thank you, Samir. I am a regulatory compliance analysis consultant, which means that I work in our department that produces content for lending institutions. We make sure that all that content is up to date. We make sure that it is tailored to meet the needs of our customers. And when it comes to this topic, I have been the subject matter expert for the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act and the Military Lending Act. And I first got started with this a couple years ago. I'm not entirely sure when for the SCRA, but for the Military Lending Act, I started first getting involved back in 2015 when the Department of Defense did their MLA update.
The way I understand it, Matt, I think you had a little bit of personal experience also in this space. Can you tell me a little bit about what that was like?
Sure. So I currently am a judge advocate in the Minnesota Army National Guard. I'm what they call M-Day, meaning it's not my full-time job. I do the traditional 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year, or at least that's what they promise us. And in 2018, our unit was mobilized to go to the Middle East in support of Operation Spartan Shield. We mainly had people in Kuwait and Jordan, with a few others scattered throughout the region. And one of the duties of judge advocates is to assist our soldiers with legal issues, which can include advising on issues such as the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act and how it can impact our soldiers.
What are the types of special circumstances that you would assist them on?
All sorts of things, honestly. For example, we'd assist them if they had any ongoing civil suits. We would make sure that those were either resolved or they were dealt with in some way. Otherwise, we would make sure that they are currently legally prepared to deploy. And some of the things that may keep service members from being able to deploy would be ongoing financial issues. For example, if they were currently in default or something like that. So you can sort of see how this sort of financial situation is important to our service members as they prepare to go overseas.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So it's kind of like you're in exactly what you said, an advocate, and also a liaison to make sure all the affairs are in order before they embark on their mission. So let's focus in on lending. What are the types of help or assistance that you can give to them? And how does that play a role into what does the MLA or what does the SCRA really say about lending and lenders need to be aware of?
Well, I think to understand the impact of legal things such as the Military Lending Act and the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act, we have to understand the unique challenges that service members have. And financial institutions need to understand those challenges and work to address them as well, which will benefit both the service members, but also the institutions, because service members, well, they talk about lending institutions that are able to sort of craft a good customer experience that meet their needs. Financial institutions can gain a lot of good reputation by doing that. So one unique aspect of military lending is that the financial situation of a service member is not simply a personal thing. It actually impacts the military as a whole. The vast majority of service members require a security clearance of some sort. And as part of the approval process, they check the credit score, they check the debt, all those things of the service members. And a negative financial history can impede or even prevent granting the security clearance.
Is that something that's done on a iterative process, like multiple times while they're on a mission, or is that a one time and then they're good to go?
So you have to get a security clearance. It has to be renewed, essentially. It's either 10 years or 5 years. There may be some other special different time frames, but for just a basic secret security clearance, it would be every 10 years. So it is something that needs to be looked at on a repeating basis. There is a little bit of downtime between the renewal process, but it does mean that service members do have to keep their financial records and their financial history good enough for them to not be looked at with concern.
What are some other concerns that a service member would have from a financial perspective?
Another concern that a service member would have, if you think about it, is financial situations. They can be very consuming when it comes to the amount of time and energy and thought that you have to put into dealing with them. So a service member who is worrying about, say, whether he or she is going to miss a payment on a mortgage loan, thus causing a default, triggering a foreclosure, well, that person is not likely going to be 100% focused on the mission.
Are there any other extenuating circumstances why lenders need to pay attention to service members in a way that they don't for the general public?
Absolutely. The Department of Defense is, of course, a large organization, a government organization, and there sometimes can be issues, unfortunately, with getting paid on time. Things such as government shutdowns could cause anxiety, even if pay isn't ultimately impacted. There might be administrative errors due to the incredibly complicated nature of military pay that cause a service member to be paid later than they should be. And when you talk about reservists, members of whether it's the Federal Reserves or the National Guard, when they take a leave of absence from their civilian job, there could be a gap between when they last received pay from their civilian job and from when they first received military pay. And it's possible that this is more of a concern for National Guard members because oftentimes the administrative systems used by Guard units is somehow separate from the systems used by the regular Army. I'm not by any means an expert on that, but I have seen it happen. The Federal Reserves may have that issue as well, but again, I'm with the Guard. And regular full-time service members have their own unique challenges as well. They may move from regular duty station to duty station every couple of years. I just actually saw a presentation this morning where it was talking about the spouses of regular service members. And because of their unique situation, especially moving and not being able to stay in one place, they have a much higher rate of unemployment and underemployment than spouses of civilians. So that can be an issue as well. And going back to these service members, I mean, they may be stationed overseas. They may be in a combat zone with very limited or no access to regular phone or email. And this, of course, makes it difficult to respond to issues. So say there is a service member deployed to a combat zone who spends most of the time outside the wire, has very little access to the phone or internet, and there's some sort of administrative error, and the service member doesn't get paid on time and misses a mortgage payment. The bank sends the notice of missed payment and indicates the loan will default if the situation isn't remedied. That service member may have significant difficulties trying to address the problem, especially if that person doesn't have a trustworthy person acting as the agent under a power of attorney, which sadly happens more than you might think. Or maybe it's not a pay error at all, but the person who is the agent under the power of attorney has just cleaned out the bank account and disappeared with the money.
Does that happen often?
I don't know if I would say often, but it happens enough where it's pretty much a cliche in the military.
I want to dive in a little bit into the idea of the power of attorney with you and understand what kind of clients are we dealing with that you're advising or your teams have advised in the past with how to stay, really smart and vigilant about how to manage finances while being away.
Sure. And of course, you get a mix of, different clients with different experiences and whatnot. But the people we really try to focus on are the young kids, essentially. People who are 18, 19, 20. They probably aren't terribly financially sophisticated. They may never have actually had to open a bank account. They're limited in their experience. And because of this, things such as powers of attorney, we don't assume they know what that means. When we sit down with them, we say, okay, a power of attorney, this is a very powerful thing. This is something that allows someone to act as you. And because of this, you need to have someone that you trust, because this person could conceivably clear out your bank account, could buy things with your money. And sometimes we have service members who enter into relationships and even get married quicker than they would if they were not being deployed. And for active duty service members, there are also different benefits to getting married, such as getting married housing, moving out of the barracks, that are sort of inducements to perhaps rush a little bit to get married. And so when you're talking to these younger service members, you need to explain to them all the legal rights, obligations, et cetera, that come along with either giving someone the power under a power of attorney or getting married to someone, and what's different marital interests and whatnot, how they play out. So those are kind of the young, financially unsophisticated soldiers, service members, et cetera, that these sort of regulations are trying to come in and protect.
Are there different levels then? I mean, can someone be a power of attorney designee for just certain types of transactions? So let's say, if it was a mortgage, they can only transact on the mortgage versus maybe administer a bank account?
Yes, absolutely. The different states tend to have different model forms. For example, the one for Minnesota will have, I am giving so-and-so the power to be my agent as a power of attorney. And then what it will do is it will set off a checklist of different things. And you can check off which things you want the agent to have power. For example, I want the agent to have power to dispose of real property. And if you want that, you check that off. If not, you leave that blank. I want the agent to have the power to give gifts in my name, etc. There's also other things such as you can put a time limit. This power of attorney will expire at this certain date. So we go through all those different customizations of the power of attorney forms and, try to really just have it fit their needs.
When we have personnel deployed overseas, and I understand how difficult it can be to have physical presence, back home to make these transactions work, but technology's advanced quite a bit. And there's a lot of electronic means today to assist. How does the military perceive or look at the viability of that?
I would say it really kind of depends on where the service member is deployed, what the mission is. Certainly, you are absolutely correct. It does make it much easier to interact with lenders and, fulfill financial obligations, respond to any sort of concerns that may arise. And this is really one area, too, where lenders can sort of enhance the experience for service members and make it easier for them. Because, of course, if you have such things as online banking, which I realize may be pretty much, very common nowadays, but the more online services, the more ways that people have to interact with the financial institution, the easier they're going to make it for their service members as well. That being said, as we've noted, there may be situations, circumstances where service members simply do not have access to stable phone or internet, especially if they are in a combat zone or if they are doing missions in remote regions of the world. And of course, there are also different challenges such as differing time zones. If you are half the world away, it's going to be more difficult contacting a lender when it's midnight, when it's noon there. So yes, newer advances in technology can certainly help. Does it completely erase the challenges that military service members face? No, I don't think so. And so I think there still needs to be a way to sort of address the needs of military service members that cannot be fully addressed with technology, while still having technology facilitate a better experience for both the financial institution and the service member.
So what happens when the individual is ready to be deployed? Is there a standard practice that every lender knows, or do they have a checklist of they have to have these conversations with individuals that really take care of their lives here back at home?
There is a mobilization process, and in that process, we kind of go through different stations. There's, the medical station, make sure that you're medically fit, et cetera. And then one of the stations is going to be a legal station where we go through sort of all the legal things, such as anything that deals with the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act, if there's any pending civil actions, et cetera. And they do, at least in the Army, that's the only thing I have experience with. But I would imagine the other services have similar things. They do have different resources available for service members to come and sort of discuss any sort of outstanding financial issues.
So let's talk about military lending. And from your opinion, is it a unique type of lending? Because I don't recall us putting service members into a protected class in the lending process. But I'd like to just learn what your perspective is and what does it mean if a institution goes above and beyond to make sure that they're compliant and they're giving the best foot forward for those personnel.
Yes. While it's not a legally protected class, there are some unique aspects, especially when you get young service members with money. So, for example, when I went to college, I worked part-time just a little bit in the summers and whatnot, but I had to pay for certain things, any sort of food outside. I didn't have much disposable income, really. And of course, I was getting college student loans, all that good stuff. Now you have these young service members who are, say, 19 years old, got promoted even just once to second class of private, and they're earning about $2,000 a month pre-tax. And when they're living in the barracks and they're probably eating food paid for by the government, they don't really have that many bills to pay. So perhaps just a cell phone and maybe advanced Wi-Fi if they don't like the Wi-Fi provided them. So they have a lot of money burning in their pocket, essentially, compared to most young people. And when you're that young, you're kind of susceptible. By which I mean, when I was driving around Fort Benning, I was looking at billboards that would say E2 and above guaranteed financing. And E2, that's that pay grade of the second level of private. So these lenders were targeting these young, financially inexperienced soldiers and saying, hey, you can get this nice, fancy car. And when you're young and you have excess money burning in your pocket, well, it's unfortunately a common stereotype in the military that you will go buy that expensive car. And if you don't know what, say, APR is, well, then you might get that car at a exorbitant APR rate, like 25%. And of course, those kind of payments, they start to add up. You have that nice new car, you're buying a brand new TV, you're buying video games and video game systems, you're buying junk food, and all of a sudden, you realize, hey, my money's running out. So what do? You go and you either get a title loan on that car that you're already paying off, or you go get a paycheck loan.
When we're talking about the individual who's run into some positive cash flow, decides to want to buy a big ticket item like a vehicle, some would say, hey, okay, that's freedom of choice for making that decision. But then also, as you and I both know now, a younger individual who probably doesn't have a lengthy credit history, right, is a little bit more of a risky customer to a bank. So are they being treated unfairly, or is it just, hey, the situation is that they're learning responsibility from a credit perspective, and banks are giving them maybe even a better deal than they would for someone in the same situation who did not have military service employment?
And I think this all goes back to the whole idea that it's not just an individual burden on the service member because of the impact it has on the military. For example, in the rule, the MLA's 2015 rule, the DoD basically says this is a readiness issue. Here I am giving my own little interpretation of it, but this is how I look at it. Regulations like the Military Lending Act and statutes like the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act, they're not financial laws that deal with the military. I think you need to look at them as military laws, military rules, regulations, and statutes that deal with finances, because the DoD has said, we believe that this impacts our military readiness. And that was kind of a discussion with the MLA. when the proposed rule was first put out, these lenders would say, hey, this isn't how we normally do things. And we feel like we're going to be limited in what sort of products we provide to service members if you set these strict restrictions for these certain types of transactions, these certain credit types. And the Department of Defense basically said, you guys will figure it out because this is important to us. And it is a military readiness issue.
So let's get back to the story that you were telling me. Now I'm borrowing against my paycheck, or I'm borrowing against the title of the big ticket item. What happens next?
Well, then you get into basically a credit debt cycle where you're stuck. And this is where you start to worry about, can the service member get a security clearance now? Is the service member going to be dealing with these financial issues when they are deployed overseas, when they really should be focused on the mission? And this is the reason why we have things such as the Military Lending Act. It's to sort of prevent these service members from getting into these situations where it will impact their military service.
Explain that just a little bit further. Give me an example that's hard hitting in the storyline that we're talking about. Instead of getting a 25% APR, what would I get because of the Military Lending Act?
So the Military Lending Act has its own specific military APR, and it's capped at 36%. And I know there have been proposals to lower that cap because 36% is still pretty high.
It's really high.
It really is. But you can see the fact that they felt a need to have a 36% cap means that they were being charged super exorbitant APRs. And especially when it comes to things such as, like paycheck loans and title loans, the APRs would be just ridiculous. And other things such as, the MLA prohibitions essentially on prepayment clauses. So you can't prohibit the right to prepay the entire loan. You can't have the conditions of the loan require the borrower to give up their rights. So any sort of important waivers that they may have under federal or state law, the MLA says you can't have them sign a waiver saying, no, I waive my right to X, because they know that these individuals may not even know what rights they're waiving. Arbitration, they can't be forced to submit to arbitration in MLA transactions because, again, the borrowers, they're not sophisticated and they might not know, well, what rights am I giving up if I agree to arbitration? So these sort of provisions are the sort that are trying to address the circumstances that these young, financially unsophisticated service members have.
So it sounds like some pretty good provisions are in place to really take the novice or the beginner individual who's just getting their credit history built and really organizing their finances. What about the ones that have already been there and are kind of seasoned at day-to-day finances and how to keep things moving along for themselves?
Certainly. And we talked about the situations, of course, where we have service members who are perhaps unable to contact lenders, financial institutions because of their circumstances. So the Military Lending Act does prohibit certain things that are trying to address that situation as well. One big prohibition is that lenders cannot impose onerous legal notice provisions when there's any kind of disputes, because the DoD recognizes that even if it's standard practice to require a borrower to respond to a bank notice within a certain time frame, it may be unreasonable for a deployed service member to do so. And this prohibition works both ways as well, because the lender is prohibited from demanding unreasonable notice from the borrower as a condition for the borrower's legal action. And these terms, onerous legal notice provisions and unreasonable notice, are not defined or explained, which is why it's important for lenders to understand the unique difficulties that service members face so they can modify their practices and credit agreements and notes accordingly. And this is especially important because any credit agreement, note, other contract that contains prohibited provisions is void from inception. And there are other noteworthy provisions as well. Again, the prohibition against arbitration, that doesn't just apply, of course, to the younger service members. And the requirements to waive rights, again, applies to everyone. You can see how this protects everyone as well, because there may be circumstances where there are two different parties on a note or a credit agreement. And if one of them is away and the other is required to submit to arbitration, that could unduly, of course, infringe the rights or obligations of the deployed service member. So all those things are kind of custom tailored to both advance the interest or protect the interests of younger service members and also the more experienced ones as well.
Are there any limitations with where the protection goes or enforces?
The limitations are once there are no covered borrowers on the transaction, which basically means once there are no military members on active duty, then the MLA no longer applies.
So you have to be active duty in order for it to apply?
Yes, correct.
Let's turn to SCRA. What does that cover as opposed to MLA?
Covers a lot, actually. I'll start off with a provision that's especially dear to reservists, myself included. SCRA creates a 6% interest rate cap for debt as long as the service member was obligated prior to entering active duty service. So essentially, if you have a credit card or a mortgage loan, and of course, nowadays with low interest rate and mortgage, it's not that impressive. But in the days of higher interest rates, it was, or any sort of car loan, any sort of line of credits that you have before you are called up to active duty, there's a 6% rate cap on that. And this is one of the examples of where lenders can actually sort of build reputation and help out service members, because I know of banks that actually did a 4% interest rate cap. I know of one that even did a 0% interest rate cap because, again, people were talking about it and it was impressive.
New business for them, and it helps the service members out quite a bit.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it made me kind of reconsider my opinion. Maybe these financial institutions were worth checking out. So yeah, it benefits multiple parties, which is really nice. And aside from the interest rate cap, the biggest protections really are those addressing contract breaches, defaults, repossession, and foreclosure. Like the interest rate cap, these provisions generally only apply to transactions where, again, the service member was obligated before entering active duty military service. So really, when you talk about how there are limitations to the SCRA, it recognizes that it would be kind of unfair if you were to be in military service and then try to get a house or get a car and then be protected from foreclosure, knowing that you would be protected essentially. This is really for the situation where reservists are called up and it's a change in life circumstances because they are no longer in their civilian role and now they are going to be usually deployed overseas and they want to sort of put things on pause while they are serving the country. So mortgage foreclosure proceedings have protections. Lenders can't seize, foreclose, or sell the property without court approval or a valid waiver by the service member. And this is important. That waiver must be made during military service, not during loan origination. And so I just said a minute ago, that the protections apply to credit lines and loans that are made prior to entering into service. So that means that there is going to be a considerable time period between the loan origination and when that waiver must be signed. In other words, you can't just have that waiver be a standard part of your loan origination package.
So it's always going to be part of a loan modification of some sort.
I don't think it necessarily has to be part of a modification, but it would need to be some time during the servicing process. So if a lender wanted to, once they received word that their borrower is going into military service, say they get the notification from the service member because they're asking for the 6% interest rate cap. And if they wanted to ask whether or not the service member would be willing to waive SCRA rights when it comes to things such as foreclosure, they could do so at that point. I don't know how good that would be reputationally, honestly, but it would be an option.
What else does this apply to?
Well, so there are not only protections for mortgage foreclosure proceedings, but also there's protections for residential or motor vehicle leases. Because, of course, you're not going to get much value out of a house lease or a car lease when you have been called up to deploy somewhere else. And this helps out reservists who are called to service with little advance warning too, due to an emergency, because they were suddenly moved to a deploying unit to replace someone else, or for whatever reason, really. And the ability to terminate a lease also does apply to active duty service members who entered into a lease under certain conditions. Again, this would be more of, this was an unexpected, unplanned life event. And one final thing I think we should note for the SCRA is that courts, they interpret it very liberally. In fact, it's been mandated by the Supreme Court all the way back since 1943. And this was for its direct predecessor, the Soldier and Sailor Civil Relief Act, but it does apply also to the SCRA. As a case from 1948 says, it should be interpreted with an eye friendly to those who dropped their affairs to answer their country's call. And we took this court ruling and we thought to ourselves when we were looking at our content for MLA that if courts were very liberally construing the SCRA to be friendly to service members, we are guessing that they will also construe the MLA similarly, which is why when you go back to your comment about it's not quite a protected class, true, it's not, but courts are going to generally be very protective of service members.
So both of these provisions and military lending as a whole, or service member lending as a whole, is really an opportunity for lenders to help mitigate some of the challenges for those that serve in our armed forces. And there could potentially be awards for doing so because those that serve are so vast in volume that it can be looked at as patriotic, new business, as well as just doing our part, so to speak, is making the country function.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And of course, for smaller institutions and even larger institutions, we recognize that there may be some challenges with sort of implementing and addressing the needs of military service members. And that's why, for example, Wolters Kluwer is there to help. For example, our eForms, Xperia products, they support MLA transactions. We continue to monitor for any updates for military lending, whether it involves the MLA, SCRA, or anything else. So they are not alone. We can help. And as you said, there is a good opportunity for business growth and reputational growth.
Matt, thank you for talking to me today. And definitely think our listenership has had something to ponder a little bit further and really think about. Greg, let me turn things back over to you.
That's Wolters Kluwer Vice President of Banking Compliance Solutions, Samir Agarwal, joined on this episode by Matthew Frank, a regulatory compliance analysis consultant with Wolters Kluwer. Wolters Kluwer hosts this podcast and is a market-leading provider of advisory services and technology solutions for optimizing compliance and risk management programs. For more information and additional guidance, please visit wolterskluwer.com or call 1-800-397-2341. Please join us for future podcasts focused on navigating emerging trends in regulatory compliance.